Today, Biden explained his administration's efforts to ease the supply chain shortages and bring down the rising cost of goods as inflation spikes. The Labor Department reported today that inflation was even worse than expected. The Consumer Price Index jumped 6.2% in October, the biggest surge in inflation in 30 years. Earlier, I had a chance to sit down with former Labor Secretary Robert Reich to talk about the state of the economy. Take a listen. Professor Reich, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really wanted to talk to you about the crosswinds in the economy, things that are kind of confusing and contradictory to me. You know, at the very same time that we have, employment numbers that look great, people saving and having more money on hand than, in a long time. Economy looks like it's doing well, but at the very same time, you used to have this inflation that we saw today, the new report that has inflation at a 30-year high. You have people not feeling confident about the economy. What gives here?
Well, a couple of points, Charles. Number one, this economy is almost entirely dependent on overcoming COVID. What got us into trouble initially in February and March of 2020, and what is getting us out of that trouble is that we were in the pandemic, and now we seem to be, hopefully, coming out of the pandemic. So the normal problems of an economy really don't apply to this particular economy. And that's why this is so hard to figure out, because all the normal rules and all the normal ways in which we measure things and all the normal assumptions don't quite work. It is very true that jobs are coming back. It is also very true that a lot of people, having gone through the pandemic, are saying, look, I'm not sure I want that old job back again, or I want better working conditions and better wages. I'm going to strike, or I'm quitting, or they're doing a lot of things that are slightly unusual. The other point that needs to be made is that we are seeing inflation, but it's not normal inflation. This is an inflation that is coming out of basically a lot of difficulties that suppliers are having getting their supplies to their customers, many of them corporate customers. So there are bottlenecks all around the world. There are bottlenecks at our ports. There are difficulties getting as many semiconductor computer chips produced as are needed. There are bottlenecks in terms of getting wood products to where they are needed and as much as is needed. The reason you have all of these bottlenecks is very simple, because when we went into the pandemic, we went in not expecting we were going to be going into a pandemic, and that for a year and a half, the entire world economy basically shut down. And getting it to start up again is tough. It is difficult. It is complicated, and all that means that that prices are going to take a while to settle down.
So that that is important to acknowledge on the supply side, that the supply chain is disrupted and that the global market took a hit onto itself. But there is also this psychological piece where people don't feel like they're doing well. The average household checking account balance was 50% higher in July of this year than it was in 2019, according to JP Morgan Chase Institute. And yet, Gallup just found that 68% of respondents last month thought the economic conditions were getting worse for them. So is there a psychological component here where people have been set upon by the pandemic and they feel like things are horrible, even though they're flush with cash basically, and there are jobs available? People, like you just said, are choosing not to take those jobs or walk away from those jobs. Is there a psychological component that is also put into flux here that's making it very hard to use the old rules of economics to apply to this market?
Yes, I think there's a major psychological factor here, and perhaps the best way of thinking about this is to look back a year and a half ago, how bad things were. people were really hard up. They were hard up not only economically, but also physically, psychologically, spiritually. The pandemic was causing massive deaths, and I think that the anticipation among almost everybody was, once we get all of this behind us, we're going to be in terrific shape. In other words, we are so bad off now that looking back, and we're just going to be just getting this over with is itself a huge goal. And what we discover is, we may be over it, but some of the pandemic is still with us. Some of the bad economy is still with us. We still are worried about all sorts of things, including our democracy and Donald Trump and racism and all of the things that we have been worried about for at least 4 years, if not decades or centuries. They're still with us, and I think that psychological reality is kind of a drag. A lot of people say, well, you know what? I expected to be so much better off once this was over, and I am not nearly as better off as I expected and wanted to be. The other piece of this, Charles, is that when you get a new president, and I don't care who the president is, when you get a new president, the hopes are very high, and it's very difficult for any new president, and I've been through this because I've been in administrations where this was the case. It's very hard for any new president to really fulfill all of the hopes and expectations that people have, because it's very, very difficult to get anything done in Washington.
So let's stay on that political question for just a minute. Manchin is already using these inflation numbers to say, hold up, we don't need to spend as much with the Build Back Better plan, which is still up in the air. It's not clear that they will be able to pass it. They did not get assurances from the moderates that they would absolutely pass it. They basically got assurances that they would look at it with fresh eyes after the CBO scored it. Do you believe that the sense that there is economic problems in America, the idea that this inflation is on the rise, will be a kind of a political tool that is used to prevent things like the Build Back Better plan from getting passed?
Yeah, undoubtedly. In fact, the Republicans are already they have been using for months, they've been using inflation. And I think that conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin are certainly also going to be pointing to inflation and saying, what they do say, that the last thing we do need now is more stimulus, that we've already had too much stimulus causing inflation. I think what Democrats need to do, and the president needs to do, is not only talk about how important these elements, these measures in Build Back Better are. For example, childcare or paid family leave. They're important in and of themselves, but they also make Americans more productive. And if Americans are more productive, then there is less reason to worry about inflation, because people can actually work more and work harder, and essentially prices will come down faster. The other thing that needs to be said here, and it's not being said nearly enough, is that big corporations in America are more profitable right now than they have ever been. We are seeing record corporate profits. Now, how can you have record corporate profits and inflation at the same time? If you had really competitive markets, in other words, if corporations were really worried about some other corporation taking away their customers, they wouldn't be raising their prices. If they had any ability not to raise their prices, they would not be raising their prices. Right. What we are seeing right now is the consequences of corporate market power, of corporate concentration in this economy. And I think the Biden administration has got to talk about antitrust. It's got to be very aggressive in terms of its rhetoric and also the reality of what it does to break up all of these concentrations of market power at the level of big corporations.
Professor Rice, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate your time.